Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff. Today I make a miniature diorama of my mate Mitch from his YouTube channel Hoochos. So Hoocho is a mate of mine and his channel has done really well in the last few years, in no short part thanks to his dedication and hard work. So he's inspired me to do a little bit of that of my own. Also nagged me a lot. Also bought me a printer. So, as a thank you, I'm going to make a miniature diorama from Hoocho. I'll need a reference, so I'm going to jump onto YouTube and have a look at Hoocho's channel.
Welcome back to Hoochos.
So to start the build, I jumped online and found a website where I could make a version of Mitch. Unfortunately, I didn't film myself painting the miniature, but I did get a few in-progress photos along the way. So now I have my finished little Hoocho. I decided he needed a home. So I jumped on YouTube, pulled off a screenshot from one of his more popular videos, and got to building. As usual, I pinched a few things off Thingiverse, made some shapes and started kitbashing. I made sure to keep the miniature of Hoocho in the design to try and keep the scale as good as possible, constantly referring back to that original image. After exporting and giving it a few hours on the printer, I have myself a few minis to work with. I also printed off the IDC tanks and a few plants from a Kickstarter that I supported. Covering everything with the trusty Fiddly Bits grey primer from Bunnings before hitting a gloss white on the tanks. The Hoocho model's starting to come together, and turns out just in time for an impromptu visit from the man himself.
That thing? Are you feeling that sick?
Now, with Hoocho's approval, it's time to move on to the base. Paying homage to Mitch's logo, I used my new Ender 3 to make the perfect base. Shaped like his famous puck system. Now we just needed it to look a little bit more natural. So I covered the whole thing in some cheap PVA glue. Spreading it out and making sure to get it right to the edges. Now I cover the whole thing in dirt. Trying to get a few different varieties from around the house just to add a more natural variation. It then gets a spray with isopropyl alcohol and a water glue mix to help keep everything solid and in place. It might look like a wet muddy mess right now, but when it dries, it comes up looking really natural. I paint the edging of the tank in a silver and then pull out some bits and pieces that I've printed out for this build. I take some of the plants that I printed and painted earlier and start putting them in place. What doesn't fit gets clipped off to fit in place. I put some hobby glue into the first tank and place the first couple of plants. I then get a container of dirt and fill in the gaps. Now I have to fill in the system, so I paint up a few of the plants that I've printed out and start gluing everything in place. After the 3D printed plants, I started adding in some flowers. There are many companies that make their own flower tufts, but I often make my own for variation in colour. I will be making a more in-depth tutorial on how I make flowers and other plants, but for now it's just basically gluing a little bit of coloured sand onto some existing smaller tufts. Once I was happy with the variation in colour, I moved on to the base. I put down some glue in my usual method and got to play with my new toy. I finally got a static grass applicator. This uses static electricity to make sure that all these little bits of grass stick up the right way. Now I get rid of the excess and collect it up on a piece of paper. Taking some fine dirt that I use for basing, I spread it over the area to fill in anywhere that's left with glue and blend it in with the rest of the model. Now it's time to add some details. I painted up these tiny little snails, as well as some frogs, birds, and some other little critters. Adding these on with the globs of super glue and adding some extra details as I went. Working with things this small was definitely difficult, but it was worth it in the end because these fine details have probably found their way into my regular building techniques from now on, especially on the Feywild builds that I'm currently working on for my Dungeons & Dragons campaign. To add some more details to the base, I get out my Green Stuff World Tiny Leaves Hole Punch and punch some tiny leaves out of some regular leaves. I then gather them up and start to spread them out over some glue that I've spread over the base. I clip a few more to add some colour variation, and then I add some static grass over the top of them. I do this method over the rest of the base in patches, and then I add some dirt to blend them all together like with the rest of my basing. Now to help Hoocho match in with the diorama, I'm going to repeat the process of the base but on a much smaller scale. So adding some glue, adding a few of the leaves, some grass, and eventually the dirt. Now Hoocho looks like he belongs. It's time to go in and clean up all the details on the original print. After adding some black paint to the supports, I realised I needed to sturdy these up. So I used some toothpicks and painted them black, super gluing them in place to add some extra support to the legs. I gave the palette a quick dry brush before gluing it to the tank. And then gluing the main piece to the base, adding a little bit of dirt to help cover up that glue. I got a cheap removable insect screen to use as the shade cloth. I measured it up and cut it to size with a scalpel. I came back in to fix up a few of the details before gluing the shade sail down. And I took advantage of the wet glue by adding in a couple more small details. And since I used too much glue, why not add in a little frog? And now for a bit of a cleanup. We'll trim off the sails with some scissors to get them to the right size, add some eyes onto the frog, and we'll paint the border of this model black. Adding in a few more brown details to the timber areas and making sure that all the supports underneath are fully covered up. Now for a few little fun details of my own. So I'm building out a base here with a clear PVA glue, but I intend on doing my first ever resin pour for this build, so let's see how that goes. So I started to mix together the 2-part epoxy resin that I got on Amazon and started to stir. This pour was one of the more satisfying things that I've experienced, and I'm definitely going to have to do a lot more resin pours in future builds. I run a lighter flame over top of the model to help remove any bubbles from the surface, and then I get a couple of tiny fish miniatures that I've painted up with contrast paints and try and put them in place. This right here is the true secret to Hoocho's garden and how come everything grows so well. And for my final few details, I thought I'd add his pets. First up we've got the youngest, Fern, then Floki, and the cats Radagast and Ragnar. Now gluing the last few bits and pieces in place and making sure that everything stays where it should be. And there we have it. What started out as just making a little miniature hooch has turned into a much bigger diorama, creating one of his full sets from one of his most popular videos. I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out, and I think that adding all these smaller details was definitely worth the time and effort. If you're interested in hydroponics or gardening, check out Mitch's YouTube channel, Hoochos. Cheers for the inspiration, Hoocho.